Sweetheart, you've just never been the one who takes risks. The microphone carried my mother's voice across the rooftop terrace. Glasses paused midair. My sister smiled, basking in applause for her promotion, while I stood near the edge of the skyline like background decor. A few people laughed. Someone actually nodded. I felt every eye slide toward me. I straightened my cufflinks, looked past the city lights, and said nothing. Because in exactly 3 minutes, the owner of this building was scheduled to take the stage. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. My mother didn't even look at me when she said it, which somehow made it worse. She kept her eyes on my sister, one hand wrapped proudly around the stem of her champagne flute, the other resting on the small of her back like she was presenting a trophy she'd personally polished. Emily has always been bold, she continued into the microphone, her voice warm and amplified over the soft jazz drifting through the rooftop speakers. She takes chances. She puts herself out there. Not everyone is wired that way. A pause. A light laugh. Some people prefer to play it safe. There were about 80 people there, colleagues in tailored suits, regional managers, 2 vice presidents, and a handful of extended family members who had driven in just to be seen. The skyline behind them glowed gold and blue. The banner near the bar read, "Congratulations, Regional Director," in clean white lettering. My sister stood beside Mom in a fitted navy dress, chin lifted, smiling modestly as if she hadn't orchestrated every detail of this evening. When the applause swelled, she leaned into the microphone and said, "I guess I just wasn't afraid to risk failing." That was when the first set of eyes turned toward me. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A shift, a glance, a few raised brows. I was standing near the back, near the sliding glass doors that led into the executive lounge. I had arrived quietly, congratulated her privately, handed her a gift she barely looked at before passing it to her assistant. I had no speech prepared. I had no spotlight. I had learned years ago not to expect one. Growing up, our house had been divided into 2 categories: Emily's accomplishments and my potential. Potential was a polite word in our family. It meant waiting. It meant you'll figure it out eventually. It meant you weren't there yet. When she made varsity sophomore year, there was a custom cake. When she got into a top business school, there was a catered graduation party. When I turned down a corporate job to start my own investment firm at 24, my father sat at the kitchen table, folded his newspaper, and asked, "So you're unemployed by choice?" He didn't yell. He didn't need to. It was the tone. Calm disappointment. Emily thrived inside structures, promotions, titles, performance reviews. I built systems that didn't require applause, but that wasn't visible. It didn't photograph well. At Thanksgiving 3 years ago, my aunt had asked me, "So are you still doing that stock thing?" as if I were dabbling in a hobby between shifts. I said yes. She nodded and turned back to Emily to ask about her management trainees. I remember that night clearly because after dessert, Emily pulled me aside near the hallway bathroom and said, "You don't have to pretend you're some big entrepreneur. There's no shame in taking a stable job." She smiled when she said it. It wasn't cruelty. It was condescension wrapped as concern. I told her stability wasn't my goal. She laughed softly. "That's because you've never really taken a risk." The words had a way of circling back in this family. Risk, in their vocabulary, meant visible danger approved by institutions. Climbing corporate ladders counted. Building quiet equity did not. And the irony was almost funny, because the first real risk I ever took had been at 22, when I mortgaged the only property our grandfather left to both of us. He split it evenly in his will, a mid-rise commercial building downtown, 8 floors, aging but structurally solid. Emily wanted to sell immediately. "Cash out and diversify," she'd said confidently, parroting something she'd heard from a professor. I asked for time. I studied tenant agreements. I reviewed maintenance reports. I spent nights in that empty lobby imagining what it could become. When I proposed buying out her half instead of selling, my parents were skeptical. "You don't even know how to manage something like that," Dad said. Emily shrugged and said, "If you want to gamble your savings, be my guest." I signed the papers anyway. I leveraged every cent I had, refinanced aggressively, negotiated lease restructures with tenants who didn't think I'd last 6 months. The first year was brutal. Elevators broke. A plumbing line burst on the 4th floor. I personally met with contractors at 6 in the morning. I learned zoning regulations line by line. I didn't tell my family any of it. When they asked how things were going, I said, "Fine." They heard "fine" and translated it as mediocre. It worked in my favor. Back on the rooftop, the music lowered as my sister began thanking specific executives. "Our CEO couldn't make it tonight, but the board has been incredibly supportive," she said, "especially the property partners who've believed in expanding our regional footprint." I watched the word property float through the air like an inside joke no one else understood. Because the regional headquarters she now directed operations from was housed in the building I had refused to sell. 3 years ago, her company signed a 10-year lease for floors 5 through 7. I negotiated the contract personally through a holding company with a name that didn't trace back to me publicly. They never connected it. Why would they? To them, I was the sibling who played it safe. Midway through her speech, one of her colleagues, a tall man with a silver tie, leaned toward me and said, "You must be proud." She's a real shark, not afraid to take risks. I smiled politely. "Oh, I'm proud," I said. He nodded as if that settled it. I took a sip of water and let my gaze drift across the terrace. The city below pulsed with traffic. Somewhere between the music and the hum of conversation, I felt the old familiar pattern locking into place. Emily rising publicly, me fading conveniently into the background. But here's what people misunderstand about silence. It isn't submission. It's observation. For years, I let them narrate my story for me because it gave me something more valuable than validation. It gave me invisibility. And invisibility is leverage. About halfway through the evening, before the dessert trays came out, I stepped aside and checked my watch. The timing mattered. Everything always does. Before I go further, I'm curious where you're watching this from tonight. What city, what skyline is outside your window? Because every city has buildings people assume belong to someone else. Back home, Mom was now recounting childhood stories. Emily used to organize her crayons by color and negotiate trades with her classmates, she said proudly. She's always had that drive. Someone chuckled and asked what I used to do. She hesitated just a fraction too long. Oh, he was more cautious. That word again. Cautious. It hung in the air like a diagnosis. I remember being 9 years old, sitting at the dining room table drawing floor plans instead of playing outside. I used to design imaginary cities in spiral notebooks, labeling zoning districts, sketching rooftops. When I showed Dad, he said, "That's nice, but you can't hide behind paper forever." Emily overheard and smirked. Maybe he'll design my office one day. She probably doesn't even remember saying that. I do, because memory is another form of compound interest. Every dismissal accumulates. Every underestimation appreciates quietly. On the terrace, I could feel the evening approaching its climax. The CEO's pre-recorded congratulatory video had just played on the outdoor screen. Applause thundered. My sister's eyes shone. She believed this was her peak moment. And to be fair, she had worked hard. I don't deny that. But hard work inside a system doesn't equal ownership of it. As the event coordinator whispered to Mom about transitioning to the next speaker, I saw Emily glance at the schedule on her phone. A slight furrow crossed her brow. She leaned toward the coordinator and said something I couldn't hear. The coordinator looked confused, checked her clipboard again. Then her eyes scanned the guest list. That was the first crack. Small, barely visible, but real. Because the final speaker listed for the night wasn't a corporate executive. It wasn't a family member. It was a representative from the property group that owned this building, invited to formally announce an infrastructure partnership that would support the company's long-term growth. Emily had assumed it was symbolic, a routine landlord courtesy. She had never asked who stood behind the holding company. She never thought to. Why would she? In her mind, I was still the sibling who avoided risk. I watched her exhale, steady herself, and smile again as the coordinator tapped the microphone. Before we close tonight, the coordinator announced, we'd like to invite a representative from the building's ownership group to say a few words about the future of this space. There it was, the shift. Subtle, quiet, but irreversible. I didn't move yet. I let the silence stretch just enough to make people glance around. My mother looked mildly confused. My sister's smile flickered for half a second. And in that half second, years of polite dismissal, condescending advice, and public underestimation condensed into something sharp and focused. I set my glass down, adjusted my cufflinks, and stepped forward, knowing that what they believed about risk was about to meet the documentation they had never bothered to read. I didn't rush the stage. I didn't need to. Urgency belongs to people who are afraid they'll lose the moment. I let the silence thicken just enough that the coordinator repeated, "A representative from the ownership group?" and glanced again at her clipboard as if a name might materialize out of ink. I walked past two regional managers who were still clapping out of habit, their smiles fading as recognition caught up with them. My shoes made a muted sound against the composite decking. 80 conversations thinned into a low hum. My sister's expression shifted from polite confusion to something tighter, evaluative. She was good at reading rooms. She just had never thought to read me. I reached the microphone and thanked the coordinator by name. That was deliberate. People trust specificity. "Good evening," I said, voice level, amplified cleanly across the terrace. "For those of you I haven't formally met, I represent Alder Ridge Holdings, the ownership group for this building." I let that sit. I didn't look at Emily yet. I didn't look at my mother. I looked at the skyline as if this were routine. We acquired majority control of this property 3 years ago after a phased buyout and restructuring. Majority control. Not full. Not yet. Words matter. A few executives nodded, relieved it sounded corporate and boring. Safe. I continued. Since then, we've refinanced the debt structure twice, renegotiated 7 long-term leases, and reinvested just under $6.2 million into infrastructure upgrades. I saw one of the finance officers from Emily's company tilt his head slightly. Numbers wake up the right people. The elevator modernization alone increased property value by 12% year over year, I said. The HVAC retrofit cut operational overhead by 18. I wasn't boasting. I was itemizing. I wanted them to understand this wasn't luck. This wasn't inheritance lazily held. It was engineered. When I was 22 and signed the initial buyout agreement with Emily, the property was leveraged poorly. The previous management company had deferred maintenance to inflate short-term profit margins. I discovered that in a 3-inch binder labeled CAPEX summary, dusty, buried in a file cabinet in the building manager's office. I remember sitting on the lobby floor with that binder open, running my finger down columns of red numbers while a tenant complained about flickering lights overhead. I learned then that buildings are like reputations. If you don't reinforce them at the foundation, they collapse quietly first. The buyout wasn't clean. Emily wanted market value plus a premium because she believed the downtown district would surge. I agreed. On paper. Off paper. I structured the deal so she received cash up front and a deferred interest note tied to occupancy performance. She skimmed the summary, trusted the attorney she barely knew. I read every clause twice. I inserted a right of first refusal on any future equity sale. I inserted performance covenants that triggered voting control if occupancy rose above 90% for 4 consecutive quarters. That was the real risk I took. Not quitting a job, not launching a firm, tying my liquidity to a building everyone else thought was outdated. I didn't say any of that on the microphone. I didn't need to. Instead, I said, we're proud to have partnered with Horizon Regional as a flagship tenant. That was Emily's company. A few claps returned. Polite. I shifted my weight slightly and finally looked at her. Their growth has aligned well with our long-term asset strategy. She smiled again, but this time it was measured. Analytical. She was trying to place something. Ownership group. Majority control. 3 years. The timeline brushed against her memory. I could see it. The year she got the call about a new headquarters lease option downtown. The day she texted me casually. Looks like we're moving into a nice spot. Funny coincidence, it's near Grandpa's old building. I had replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was it. The complication didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with a question from the silver tie executive. Are you planning additional expansion on the upper floors? He asked from the audience, tone professional. I appreciated that. It meant the room hadn't yet caught the personal undercurrent. We are evaluating options, I replied. There are structural considerations and, of course, lease compliance reviews. Lease compliance reviews. Another phrase that sounds harmless until you understand what it implies. Emily's smile faltered almost invisibly, because she knew. 2 months ago, her operations team had exceeded their designated square footage by converting a storage suite into additional office space without formal amendment approval. It was small, technical, the kind of thing landlords often overlook. I did not overlook it. I received the floor plan revision through our property management portal at 2:13 p.m. on a Tuesday. I printed it. I compared it against the original lease exhibit. I marked the variance in red. Then I waited. I didn't issue a violation notice immediately. I wanted context. I scheduled a routine quarterly inspection instead. Walked the floors quietly with our building engineer. Measured door frames. Noted electrical loads. It wasn't punitive. It was precise. On the terrace, I let the word compliance linger just long enough before continuing. But tonight isn't about square footage, I said smoothly. It's about recognizing leadership. That line disarmed them. I turned slightly toward my sister. Emily, congratulations on your promotion. Applause resumed. Stronger now, grateful for direction. She nodded. Thank you, she said into the mic beside me, voice steady. We've worked hard for this. Worked. I could have corrected the pronoun. I didn't. I continued. Horizon Regional signed a 10-year lease with us at a competitive rate based on projected occupancy stability. It was a calculated decision on both sides. I let the audience absorb that word. Calculated. Not risky. Calculated. My mother watched from the side, confusion slowly morphing into awareness. Dad's jaw tightened slightly. He was doing the math in his head. 3 years ago, the buyout, the downtown move. I went on. Alder Ridge has always believed that real risk isn't loud. It's structural. I wasn't lecturing. I was clarifying. It's signing documents most people don't read. It's accepting temporary volatility for long-term control. That sentence shifted the air, because now it wasn't just a landlord update. It was philosophy backed by evidence. I stepped back from the mic slightly, as if concluding, but I wasn't finished. I gestured toward the skyline. This building was once considered outdated inventory. Vacancy hovered at 62%. Deferred maintenance exceeded 8 figures. Today we operate at 94% occupancy with stabilized debt and a projected valuation increase of 38% since acquisition. I saw the finance officer whisper to someone beside him. Numbers are anchors. They ground disbelief. I didn't mention the nights I slept in my office during the first renovation phase because contractors kept missing deadlines. I didn't mention the bank officer who told me you're young. You're over-leveraged. This won't end well. I didn't mention that I personally negotiated a bridge loan extension at 11:47 p.m. in a dim conference room with fluorescent lights humming overhead, while rain streaked the windows. I didn't mention how my hand shook slightly when I signed that extension because if occupancy didn't rebound within 6 months, I would have defaulted. I simply said, we're excited about the future. And that's when Emily made her first misstep. She leaned toward the microphone and said lightly, well, we're glad our rent checks are helping. Laughter. A few executives chuckled. It was meant to reassert dominance, to remind the room that tenants fund landlords. But she forgot one thing. Lease agreements are bilateral. Rent isn't charity. It's contract. I smiled. They are, I agreed calmly. And they're on time. The laughter thinned. Because that wasn't a joke. It was a fact layered with implication. 2 weeks ago, Horizon's accounts payable had delayed one installment due to internal restructuring. It was corrected within 48 hours. I didn't escalate it. I documented it. Documentation is quiet leverage. I glanced toward the coordinator, who was now visibly uncertain whether this was still a celebratory speech. It was, just not in the way they expected. Before we close, I said, voice steady, there are a few strategic updates our team will be sharing with Horizon's leadership next quarter regarding building-wide compliance and capital allocation. strategic updates, next quarter, leadership. Words that sound procedural until you realize they involve budget shifts and oversight reviews. Emily's posture stiffened because next quarter coincided with her first performance evaluation as regional director. And building-wide compliance reviews include tenant adherence audits. I hadn't yet disclosed the clause in the lease that allowed us to adjust common area maintenance charges based on unapproved space modifications. I hadn't disclosed the voting control trigger tied to occupancy thresholds. I hadn't disclosed that 94% occupancy for 4 consecutive quarters transferred additional decision rights to majority stakeholders. That fourth quarter closed last week. I let the microphone rest for a second longer than comfortable. Then I said, "Congratulations again, Emily. Leadership is about understanding structures you don't always see." I stepped back. Applause returned, but it was thinner now, analytical. Conversation sparked immediately in low tones. I walked off stage without looking at her again. The night resumed, but differently. Executives approached me with polite curiosity. "We should connect about long-term expansion," one said. I handed him a card with Alder Ridge's contact information. Not my personal name. Not yet. My mother approached slowly, as if stepping onto uncertain ice. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, voice low. I held her gaze. "You never asked." It wasn't cruel. It was accurate. Emily joined us seconds later, smile fixed, but eyes sharp. "So, you're involved with the building," she said carefully. Involved? I almost admired the restraint. "I am," I replied. "How involved?" she asked. There it was, the real question. Not about pride, not about family, about control. I took a sip of water before answering. Enough. She held my gaze a second too long, then nodded as if that satisfied her. It didn't. Not really, because involvement has degrees. Majority control is not full authority. Not yet. There were still layers she hadn't uncovered. Layers embedded in addendums and covenants she signed without reading closely because she trusted the structure. The same way our parents trusted titles more than assets. As the evening wound down, I watched her circulate among executives, laughter slightly forced now. She would go home tonight and pull up the lease agreement. She would search for Alder Ridge Holdings and find a management entity, not a face. She would call legal. She would ask questions. And that's when the complication would surface. Because 3 months ago, I initiated a secondary acquisition through a convertible debt instrument tied to Horizon's parent company's expansion bond. It was small, almost invisible, but it gave me insight into their capital strategy. She didn't know that yet. She would. The terrace lights dimmed slightly as catering began clearing tables. I checked my phone. A message from our building manager blinked. Occupancy certification filed. Fourth quarter confirmed. I slid the phone back into my pocket. Majority control had just shifted into something firmer. Not absolute, but directional. Emily hugged colleagues goodbye, posture still composed. She looked strong. She was strong. But strength inside a structure you don't own has limits. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt the familiar calm settle in. The kind that comes when a plan moves from theory to visible consequence. I hadn't humiliated her. I hadn't exposed anything explicitly. I had simply introduced information at the right time. The imbalance had begun to tilt, and the most important piece was still undocumented in public view. The elevator doors closed with a soft hydraulic sigh, and for the first time that night I was alone, the mirrored walls reflecting back a version of me my family had never really studied. My expression wasn't triumphant. It wasn't angry. It was measured. That's the thing about leverage. If you've built it correctly, you don't feel adrenaline. You feel timing. My phone vibrated before we reached the lobby. Emily, of course. I let it ring once longer than polite, then answered. "You couldn't have told me," she asked without greeting, voice low but sharp. I could hear the muted noise of guests still lingering behind her. "Told you what?" I asked evenly, watching the floor numbers descend. "That you own the building." "Own. Interesting choice." "I represent the majority stakeholder," I corrected calmly. Silence on the other end. She hated imprecision, especially when it wasn't hers. "Since when?" she asked. "Since the buyout," I said. "You signed." The elevator doors opened into the marble-floored lobby. I'd once scrubbed myself after a contractor left dust caked into the grout. I walked past the security desk and nodded to Mark, who had worked here longer than either of us had owned it. "Good night, sir," he said. "Sir." Emily could probably hear that faint echo of deference through the phone. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You blindsided me." I stepped outside into the cool air and looked up at the building's facade. Lights glowing across the floors her team occupied. "No," I said quietly. "I read the documents." That was the difference. She inhaled sharply. "Are you threatening something?" There it was, the pivot from disbelief to defense. "I haven't threatened anything," I replied. "But your team expanded into Suite 5B without an approved amendment. That triggers a review." Silence again, thicker this time. I could picture her replaying conversations with operations. The offhand decision to convert storage into workstations. The assumption the landlord wouldn't notice. "It was temporary," she said. "Temporary modifications still require written consent under Section 14.3. I answered without looking at the lease. I had memorized it months ago. The streetlight above me flickered once before stabilizing. Timing. She exhaled through her nose. "You're doing this because of what Mom said," she accused. "No," I said. "I'm doing this because structures matter." And then I ended the call. Not dramatically, just decisively. Over the next 72 hours, the institutional shift began quietly. I drafted a compliance review notice at 6:12 a.m. the following morning from my office, overlooking the river. I attached annotated floor plans, time-stamped inspection photos, and the relevant lease clauses highlighted in yellow. I copied Horizon's legal department, not Emily directly. Hierarchy responds to documentation, not emotion. By 9:47 a.m., my inbox chimed with a response from their corporate counsel requesting a meeting. Polite, controlled, concerned. That afternoon, I reviewed the convertible debt instrument I'd acquired through Horizon's expansion bond. It wasn't flashy. A modest position through a private placement 6 months earlier, structured through an affiliate entity that masked my personal identity but not my influence. It gave me access to quarterly capital reports and board-level projections. I knew their regional expansion strategy hinged on maintaining certain cost ratios tied to lease square footage. If common area maintenance charges adjusted upward due to compliance violations, their margins tightened. If margins tightened, leadership evaluations intensified. None of this was personal. It was mechanical. On Wednesday at 2 p.m., we met in the building's 8th floor conference suite. I chose that room deliberately. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Clear view of the city. Emily arrived with Horizon's legal counsel and their CFO, a man named Daniel who had a habit of tapping his pen when anxious. I entered last. Come. A leather folder under my arm. "Thank you for meeting," Daniel began. We were surprised by the compliance notice. Surprised. I echoed mildly, sliding the annotated floor plans across the table. "Your team submitted revised occupancy drawings to our property portal on March 3rd at 2:13 p.m. I rotated the page so the timestamp faced him. He stopped tapping his pen. Emily sat straight-backed, jaw set. "We believe the modification fell under minor interior adjustment allowances," she said. Her tone was composed, but I could see the slight pulse in her neck. "Interior adjustments don't extend load-bearing partition relocation," I replied. "The electrical reconfiguration increased capacity beyond baseline parameters." I showed them the inspection photos. Close-up of the new breaker panel. Measured cable runs. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Facts carry their own weight. "What's the remedy?" Daniel asked carefully. There it was. Not denial. Negotiation. "We conduct a formal review," I said. "Assess structural impact. Recalculate CM allocations. Potentially amend the lease at current market rates." Emily's eyes sharpened at that phrase. Current market rates were 18% higher than what she had locked in 3 years ago. "You can't retroactively adjust," she said. "We're not retroactively adjusting," I replied. "We're addressing unauthorized expansion." I let that distinction settle. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Is there flexibility?" he asked. Flexibility. A softer word for leverage. "There's structure," I said. Structure allows options. I paused then, not for effect, but because this is the point in stories where most people expect shouting. There wasn't any. Just math. Horizon's regional growth model projects an additional 20,000 square feet within 18 months, I continued. You've already pre-allocated teams internally for that expansion. Emily's head turned slightly toward me. How would you know that? She asked before she could stop herself. A small crack. Capital reports are public in certain contexts, I replied. Technically true, just not fully explanatory. The room cooled perceptibly. Daniel cleared his throat. Let's be candid, he said. Are you positioning to renegotiate the entire lease? I folded my hands. I'm positioning to protect the asset. That answer satisfied nothing and everything at once. Emily leaned forward. You're exploiting a technicality, she said quietly. No, I said. I'm enforcing a contract. That was when I noticed something shift in her eyes. Not anger. Calculation. She was finally seeing me not as her younger brother, but as a counterparty. Equal footing terrifies people who relied on hierarchy. The meeting adjourned with an agreement to conduct a joint review within 10 business days. No threats. No ultimatums. Just procedures set in motion. As we stood, Emily lingered. Daniel and counsel exited first. The door clicked shut. She faced me fully. What do you actually want? She asked. Not compliance. Not money. Something deeper. I studied her for a moment. Alignment, I said. She frowned. Alignment with what? Reality, I replied. That answer unsettled her more than any number could. Over the next week, Horizon's leadership began feeling pressure from two directions. Our formal compliance review proceeded methodically. Our building engineer documented structural tolerances. An external inspector verified load capacity deviations. I authorized a preliminary CAM recalculation model, conservative but firm. Simultaneously, through the convertible bond position, I received Horizon's updated quarterly performance summary. Their expansion was overextended. 2 other regions were underperforming. If operational costs in Emily's division increased unexpectedly, the board would scrutinize her strategy. She didn't know yet that her risk profile had shifted. That's the thing about institutional pressure. It rarely arrives as a single blow. It tightens like a vice. 3 days before the compliance review report was due, Horizon's corporate counsel called requesting a private discussion. We'd prefer to resolve this discreetly, she said. Discreetly means quietly conceding something without public documentation. Transparency protects everyone, I replied. I meant it. Hidden adjustments breed future conflict. That afternoon, an email circulated internally within Horizon's executive chain questioning whether the regional team had exceeded its authorized spatial footprint without board approval. I didn't send it. I didn't need to. Structures trigger their own alarms when numbers misalign. Emily called again that night, not accusatory this time. Controlled. They're reviewing my cost management, she said. That's typical during expansion phases, I answered. You knew this would happen, she said. It wasn't a question. I didn't deny it. I knew contracts matter, I said. Silence. Is this about proving something? She asked finally. I looked out the window at the river reflecting city lights. It's about correcting something, I replied. Halfway through this whole escalation, let me ask you something directly. If you've ever been underestimated in a room full of people who thought they understood you, where are you watching from tonight? What city? Because cities are built on contracts most people never read. She didn't answer my question. Instead, she said, Mom is confused. Dad's furious. I almost smiled. Dad respects leverage, I said. He just doesn't like when he didn't see it coming. 2 days later, the formal compliance report landed in Horizon's inbox at exactly 8 a.m. 42 pages. Appendices, photographs, calculations. The summary was simple, unauthorized expansion confirmed. Electrical load adjustments within safe tolerance but requiring amended lease terms. Recommended CAM increased proportional to square footage. Option to convert expanded suite into officially leased space at current market rate with extended term adjustment. It wasn't punitive. It was structured. By noon, Emily was summoned to a video conference with Horizon's executive board. I know because the capital report updated that afternoon flagged a regional variance review. I didn't watch the call. I didn't need to. I could picture it. Board members asking why operational costs were misaligned with approved projections. Emily explaining the expansion as strategic necessity. Legal counsel noting landlord compliance review. CFO outlining potential cost adjustments. No one accusing, just assessing. That's how reputations erode at that level. Not through scandal, through metrics. That evening, Emily requested a meeting with me alone. Not in the building, not in her office. Neutral ground, a quiet restaurant across town. She arrived without makeup, hair pulled back, exhaustion faintly visible beneath composure. "You're destabilizing my first quarter as director," she said without preamble. "Your team destabilized the lease," I replied calmly. She exhaled sharply. "You could waive the adjustment." "I could," I agreed. "On what condition?" There it was. Not indignation. Negotiation. I didn't answer immediately. I let the waiter pour water. I let the ambient noise of other diners fill the pause. "On alignment," I said again. "Define it," she demanded. I leaned back slightly. "Public acknowledgement of the partnership," I said. "Formal recognition of ownership structure. And a revised expansion plan that flows through proper channels." She stared at me. "You want credit?" "No," I corrected. "I want accuracy." That distinction mattered. She looked down at the table for a long moment. "You've been planning this since the promotion party," she said quietly. I almost laughed. "I've been planning this since the buyout," I replied. And that was the truth. Because this was never about revenge in the emotional sense. It was about recalibrating a narrative that had run unchecked for years. She lifted her gaze slowly. "If I agree," she said carefully, "what happens to the CAM adjustment?" I folded my hands on the table. "We amend at original rate tiers for the expanded space," I said. "No retroactive penalty." Her shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Relief flickered across her face before she masked it. "And if I don't?" she asked. I held her gaze evenly. "Then the board will continue reviewing cost deviations under existing compliance findings. No threats, just outcomes." She nodded once. "Slow, controlled." "You're colder than I remember," she said. I considered that. "No," I said. "I'm clearer. We left without hugging, without resolution, just a framework hanging between us like an unsigned contract." And as I walked back to my car, I knew the next move wouldn't be mine alone. Because once institutions begin shifting, they don't stop at the first crack. The shift didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a document. 2 days after our dinner, at 7:32 a.m., an email from Horizon's executive office landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Strategic Realignment Discussion." Not defensive, not aggressive, neutral. That's how corporations signal retreat without admitting it. Attached was a revised expansion proposal drafted overnight. They had scaled back the unauthorized suite conversion into a phased lease amendment request. Clean diagrams, formal language, and at the bottom, a note requesting a joint press acknowledgement of a strengthened partnership with Alder Ridge Holdings. I read it twice, slowly. They weren't just conceding compliance. They were repositioning the narrative. That meant Emily had chosen alignment. But alignment under pressure reveals more than voluntary collaboration ever does. I forwarded the proposal to our legal team with a single instruction: tighten the addendum language, preserve rate tiers, extend term by 3 years, and include formal recognition of ownership entity. Then I leaned back in my chair and stared at the river beyond the glass. 3 years earlier, I had sat in this same office calculating whether I could survive a single missed tenant payment. Now Horizon's board was drafting language to preserve my rate structure. Structures don't flip overnight. They pivot when enough pressure concentrates in the right joint. By noon, I received a call not from Emily, but from Daniel, Horizon's CFO. His voice was measured, respectful. "We'd like to finalize the amendment quickly," he said. "Market conditions are shifting and we value stability." Stability, the same word my family once used to describe a corporate salary. "We value compliance," I replied evenly. There was a pause. "Of course," he said. "And we appreciate the discretion you've shown." Discretion? I had not escalated publicly. I had not issued violation notices beyond contractual channels. That restraint had been intentional. Public humiliation destabilizes assets. Quiet leverage stabilizes them. The amendment meeting was scheduled for Friday morning in the 8th floor conference suite again. This time, however, there was a subtle difference. Horizon's regional communications director attended. So, did their head of investor relations. That wasn't about square footage. That was about optics. I arrived 5 minutes early. I always do. The leather chairs were arranged in a tighter configuration than before. A new draft agreement sat in front of each seat, bound neatly. When Emily walked in, her posture was composed, but different. Not defensive, controlled. She nodded at me once before sitting down. No small talk. Daniel opened the meeting with formalities. We've reviewed the compliance findings and agreed to formalize the expanded suite under the existing rate structure, contingent upon extended term alignment. He spoke carefully, as if each word were a stepping stone across a narrow bridge. I flipped through the revised addendum slowly, pen in hand. Clause 2.1 reflected the adjusted square footage. Clause 3.4 extended the lease term by 3 years beyond the original expiration. Clause 5.2 introduced a formal partnership statement acknowledging Alder Ridge Holdings as majority stakeholder. There it was, in print, not implied, not obscured behind shell entities. Documented. I underlined one sentence lightly. Will require a press acknowledgement issued jointly within 10 business days, I said calmly. The communications director nodded immediately. We've drafted a preliminary statement, she said, sliding a sheet toward me. I read it. It positioned the expansion as a collaborative milestone between Horizon Regional and Alder Ridge Holdings under visionary leadership. Visionary. Interesting choice. I glanced at Emily. She held my gaze steadily. No flinch. No sarcasm. She had made her decision. We signed. Not ceremonially. Not dramatically. Just ink on paper. The sound of pen scratching across contracts is quieter than applause, but far more permanent. As we stood, Daniel extended his hand to me first this time. We look forward to continued partnership, he said. Partnership. Not landlord. Not sibling. Counterparty. I shook his hand firmly. Then Emily stepped forward. For a second, it felt like the rooftop terrace again. 80 pairs of eyes and one microphone. But this room was smaller. More honest. We'll issue the acknowledgement Monday, she said. Her voice didn't waver. I'll handle it personally. That was the structural shift. Not the amended lease. Not the extended term. The fact that she chose visibility over quiet containment. Monday morning at 9 a.m., Horizon's official LinkedIn account posted a statement announcing the formalized expansion and strategic partnership with Alder Ridge Holdings, led by principal investor and managing director. My name followed. Publicly. Clearly. Tagged. Within minutes, industry contacts began reacting. Messages flooded in. Congratulations. Inquiries. Invitations. My phone vibrated nonstop. But the real moment wasn't online. It was at 9:17 a.m. when our building's lobby television scrolled the announcement in the local business news segment. Mark at the security desk looked up as I walked in and said, "Didn't know you were the guy at the top, sir." I smiled slightly. Most people didn't, I said. Upstairs on floor 6, Horizon's employees gathered near the glass-walled conference room as the internal announcement played on their screens. I watched through the reflection in the elevator doors as Emily addressed her team. We're proud to formalize our expansion in partnership with Alder Ridge Holdings, she said, tone steady. This alignment strengthens our operational foundation. Alignment. She used the word deliberately. Some of her managers glanced toward the windows overlooking the city, perhaps seeing the building differently for the first time. Ownership alters perspective. By afternoon, my parents had seen the announcement. My phone rang. Dad. I answered. Silence lingered for 3 seconds. You structured this from the beginning, he said finally. Not accusatory. Observant. Yes, I replied. Another pause. You could have told us, he said. I looked out the window at the facade I once worried would bankrupt me. Would it have changed anything? I asked quietly. He didn't answer immediately. Then he exhaled slowly. No, he admitted. That was the crack widening. Not in Horizon. In our family narrative. That evening, Mom texted me a screenshot of the announcement with a simple message I didn't understand. I stared at it for a long time before replying. You didn't ask. The compliance review officially closed with the amended agreement filed in our records. But something else had shifted beneath the surface. Through the convertible bond instrument, I received an updated capital projection reflecting stabilized regional cost metrics. Emily's division was no longer flagged for variance. Instead, it was cited as strategically adaptive under evolving partnership conditions. Language matters. That phrasing protected her evaluation. She had navigated the pressure. She hadn't collapsed. That satisfied something I hadn't fully acknowledged. This was never about destroying her. It was about recalibrating the imbalance. 3 days later, Horizon's CEO requested a private lunch. Not with Emily. With me. We met at a quiet downtown restaurant overlooking the same skyline as the rooftop party weeks earlier. We underestimated the ownership structure, he said candidly. That won't happen again. I appreciated the directness. Structures don't advertise themselves, I replied. He smiled faintly. You've built something substantial. Built. Not inherited. Not stumbled into. Built. As we discussed potential long-term capital investments in adjacent properties, I realized the system had fully pivoted. I was no longer reacting. I was shaping. But the most revealing moment came that weekend at my parents' house. Sunday dinner. Familiar dining table. Same chairs from childhood. Roast chicken in the center. For years, conversation had orbited around Emily's promotions and my projects. This time, Dad cleared his throat before we even sat down. I read the full lease amendment, he said. He had requested it from Emily. Of course he had. You negotiated control triggers tied to occupancy performance, he continued. His tone held something new. Not pride exactly. Recognition. That's risk, he said quietly. Mom looked between us, confusion fading into comprehension. Emily sat across from me, composed, eyes steady. He always understood contracts better than I did, she said calmly. It wasn't self-deprecating. It was factual. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence exist without filling it. For once, no one rushed to narrate me. After dinner, as dishes clinked in the sink, Emily stepped outside onto the back porch. I followed. The air was cool. Suburban quiet replacing city hum. You forced my hand, she said softly. You forced my perception, I replied. She considered that. You could have crushed the lease, she said. You didn't. I didn't need to, I answered. She nodded slowly. I misread you, she admitted. That admission carried more weight than the amended contract. For years, she had occupied the visible arc of success while I operated in shadow. Now the structure was illuminated. You called me cautious, I said quietly. You were, she replied, almost reflexively. Then she paused. Calculated, she corrected. I allowed myself the smallest smile. The system had turned. Not because I shouted. Not because I embarrassed her publicly. But because documentation outlasts assumptions. And yet, beneath the alignment, beneath the amended lease and public acknowledgement, one layer remained untouched. The convertible instrument tied to Horizon's parent expansion bond had matured into something convertible under specific performance triggers. Those triggers had not yet been activated. And as I stood there on that porch, listening to the distant hum of highway traffic, I realized that structural power rarely ends with one amendment. It compounds. The invitation came 2 weeks later on thick, embossed cardstock delivered by courier to my office at 10:14 a.m., hand-addressed in navy ink. Horizon Regional Leadership Summit, Executive Recognition Gala, Grand Atrium Ballroom. I ran my thumb lightly over the raised lettering before setting it down beside the convertible bond report still open on my desk. Public settings are where narratives either solidify or fracture, and this one was curated carefully. The ballroom they'd chosen wasn't in my building. It was at the Crescent Atrium downtown, a vaulted glass ceiling arching above marble floors, designed to make people feel elevated before they even sit down. The agenda listed keynote remarks from the CEO, a regional performance highlight, and a strategic partnership acknowledgement. My name appeared again, printed clearly this time. Visibility had moved from reluctant concession to planned centerpiece. I checked the bond covenants one more time that afternoon. focusing on the performance trigger threshold I had calculated months earlier at my kitchen counter while the rest of the city slept. If Horizon's parent company sustained 3 consecutive quarters of stabilized expansion ratios, my instrument converted into equity at a preset valuation discount. 2 quarters had already closed. The third would finalize the morning of the gala. Timing isn't coincidence when you've built it deliberately. On the day of the event, I arrived early again, walking through the atrium before most guests filtered in. The ceiling steel beams caught the afternoon light, reflecting it down in fractured patterns across the floor. Round tables draped in white linen filled the center, each set with precise cutlery alignment and crystal glasses that caught even the faintest movement. A stage stood at the far end, flanked by 2 massive screens projecting Horizon's logo in slow rotation. I nodded at the event coordinator, confirmed seating arrangements, and took my place at a table near the front. Not central, but visible. Emily entered 15 minutes later with her executive team. Navy dress again, posture controlled, expression unreadable. She saw me immediately. A small nod. No theatrics. That restraint mattered. The CEO opened the evening with polished remarks about resilience, strategic recalibration, and the power of partnership. Applause rose in measured waves. When he introduced Emily as regional director who had navigated early structural complexities with composure, the audience clapped longer than protocol required. She walked to the podium steady, heels clicking softly against the stage, and began outlining her division's growth metrics. Her slides moved smoothly behind her, bar graphs rising cleanly, occupancy percentages aligned with projections. Then she pivoted to the partnership acknowledgement. None of this would have stabilized without disciplined asset alignment, she said. Alder Ridge Holdings provided structural support that allowed us to expand responsibly. Her voice did not falter on my company's name. On the screen behind her, a slide appeared displaying the building facade, professionally photographed at dusk, lights glowing across the floors. My building, publicly framed as foundation rather than coincidence. The audience turned slightly in my direction, some craning subtly. I did not wave. I did not stand. I remained seated, hands folded, allowing the acknowledgement to breathe. That was the first visible reversal, but it wasn't the decisive one. After her speech, the CEO returned to the podium. We also want to recognize strategic investors who have demonstrated long-term commitment to Horizon's expansion bond initiative, he announced. My pulse didn't spike. It didn't need to. I had read the preliminary earnings report at 6:01 a.m. that morning. The third quarter stabilized above trigger threshold by a margin of 0.8%. Small on paper, transformational in structure. One such investor, the CEO continued, played a dual role in ensuring both asset stability and capital confidence. He gestured toward the screen, and my name appeared again, this time beneath the heading Principal Equity Conversion. The room shifted perceptibly. Not loud, not chaotic, just a collective recalibration. Emily's eyes moved toward me, not surprised exactly, but registering the scale of it. I stood only when invited to the stage. The walk felt longer than it actually was, heels and dress shoes echoing faintly across the marble. I shook the CEO's hand firmly before turning toward the audience. 3 years ago, I began calmly into the microphone. I signed a lease agreement and a bond subscription in the same month. I let that statement settle. Both required belief in long-term structural growth. I explained, clearly and without flourish, how bond instruments function, how performance triggers convert into equity, how stability compounds when risk is calculated rather than broadcast. I didn't use dramatic language. I used numbers. As of this morning, I said evenly, that instrument converted into an equity position representing a minority but material share in Horizon's parent entity. Audible murmurs rippled across the ballroom. Not outrage, recognition. I wasn't just the landlord. I was now, quietly, an owner at a higher tier. Emily's expression held steady, but I saw the subtle tightening in her jaw as the implications clicked into place. I wasn't destabilizing her division anymore. I was structurally tied to its broader governance. Investment isn't about noise, I continued. It's about documentation. I paused then, glancing briefly at Emily before returning my gaze to the audience. and documentation outlasts assumptions. That line wasn't rehearsed. It was earned. As I stepped back from the microphone, applause rose, not thunderous, but deliberate. Measured respect replaces polite clapping when people understand the math. The CEO leaned in slightly as we shook hands again. "Didn't realize you were building this quietly," he murmured. "Most structures are built quietly," I replied. Back at my table, messages flooded my phone again. Industry contacts, investment inquiries, board-level introductions. But the moment that carried weight came when Daniel approached. Hand extended. "Congratulations," he said, tone genuinely impressed. That was strategic. Strategic. Not lucky. Not vindictive. Emily followed a moment later. The ballroom noise faded in my perception as she stopped in front of me. "You timed it with the summit," she said quietly. It wasn't accusation. It was analysis. "The trigger closed this morning," I replied. "You knew it would," she said. I held her gaze. I structured it too. That was the truth. Months earlier, when Horizon's expansion ratios dipped slightly during an operational lag, I could have sold the bond at modest gain. Instead, I held. I reviewed their capital allocation trends. I noticed their recovery curve aligning with my compliance timeline. The trigger threshold would likely close within a quarter of the lease amendment stabilization. I adjusted nothing publicly. I simply waited. That patience was the final layer she hadn't anticipated. As the evening continued, executives approached me differently. Conversations shifted from tenant logistics to board dynamics. "Are you planning to increase your stake?" one asked. "We evaluate opportunities structurally," I replied. I wasn't posturing. I was signaling discipline. About halfway through the dessert course, let me say something plainly. If you're following this and you understand that power often sits inside documents rather than speeches, make sure you're subscribed. Not for spectacle, but for clarity. Because what happens next always belongs to those who pay attention. The final award of the night was presented to Emily for regional leadership under pressure. She walked to the stage again, accepted the plaque, and addressed the room with composed gratitude. "Growth requires recalibration," she said. "And sometimes recalibration reveals strengths you didn't anticipate." She didn't look at me when she said it, but the acknowledgement was implicit. After the applause, as guests began filtering toward the exits, the CEO approached us both. "You two make an interesting structural alignment," he said lightly. "Family enterprises can be volatile." I met his gaze evenly. "Stability is engineered," I replied. Outside, beneath the glass canopy of the atrium, the night air carried a faint chill. Valet attendants moved briskly, engines humming softly. Emily stood beside me for a moment before speaking. "You didn't humiliate me," she said quietly. "You elevated yourself." "And you," I replied. She considered that. "You could have triggered the compliance clause more aggressively," she added. "I didn't need to," I said. "You chose alignment." She nodded once. "You've always been patient," she said. I almost laughed softly. "No," I corrected. "I've always been reading." She smiled faintly at that. Not defensive this time, not dismissive. A recognition of parity had replaced the old hierarchy. The visible collapse wasn't hers. It was the narrative our family carried for years, the one that framed risk as loud and caution as weakness. That story had quietly folded in on itself in a ballroom, filled with executives and crystal glasses. As my car pulled away from the curb, I glanced back at the illuminated atrium ceiling reflecting the city lights above. Structures had shifted publicly now. Ownership layered across lease and equity alike. But structural compounding rarely stops at a single conversion. The equity position opened doors to governance influence, committee votes, capital direction. And as the city skyline slid past my window, I knew the real leverage wasn't in applause. It was in the quiet voting rights that would be exercised next quarter. The morning after the summit felt almost ordinary, which is how you know something irreversible has happened. There was no dramatic headline, no scandal, no collapse in stock price, just a quiet shift in tone. At 8:03 a.m., an updated shareholder registry reflected my converted equity position in Horizon's parent entity. It was a minority stake, carefully calculated, but it carried voting rights. Not symbolic, not honorary, binding. I printed the confirmation on heavy stock paper and placed it in the same drawer where I had once kept the initial buyout contract for the building. The arc had closed structurally. 3 years ago, I leveraged everything I had for a property people thought was outdated. Now I held a position in the corporation, leasing its core floors, not through inheritance, through layered documentation. That distinction mattered to me more than any applause from the ballroom the night before. The financial aftermath unfolded methodically. The amended lease stabilized Horizon's operating costs under extended term projections. The CM adjustment was recalibrated under the negotiated rate tiers, preserving their margins. In exchange, the longer lease commitment increased my building's projected cash flow certainty by 12%. I took that projection to the bank that had once hesitated to extend my bridge loan and renegotiated my interest rate downward by 80 basis points. Not a favor, a recalculated risk profile. The bank officer who had doubted my leverage years ago shook my hand with different energy. This time, "Your asset performance has matured," he said. I almost smiled at the understatement. Performance had matured because I matured it. The equity stake created another layer of consequence. Horizon's governance committee scheduled quarterly strategy calls that I was now entitled to attend. On the first call, I listened more than I spoke. Expansion initiatives, capital allocation, risk exposure. I took notes in clean, precise handwriting, circling patterns rather than reacting to rhetoric. When the CEO asked for minority investor input toward the end, I offered a single suggestion about phasing regional buildouts in alignment with stabilized lease commitments. Not aggressive, just logical. The suggestion was adopted into the minutes. Influence doesn't need to be loud to be permanent. Social fallout was subtler but no less tangible. Industry publications that had once quoted Emily exclusively in local business features began including my name when referencing Horizon's structural alignment. At networking events, introductions shifted from Emily's brother to principal at Alder Ridge and Horizon stakeholder. I didn't correct people before. I didn't need to now. Correction had become unnecessary. The narrative rewrote itself because documentation forced it to. At my parents' house, Sunday dinners changed in tone more than content. Dad asked me about interest rate spreads. Mom asked questions about occupancy ratios. Not because they suddenly loved commercial real estate, but because the language of risk had been reframed in their minds. Emily and I no longer circled each other with polite condescension. Our conversations became analytical, measured, equal. The first time she asked my opinion on a staffing decision for her division, I noticed she didn't soften her tone. She wanted clarity, not reassurance. That was progress. The legal consequences were non-existent because I had engineered compliance, not conflict. There were no lawsuits. No public disputes. The compliance review closed cleanly. The lease amendment filed properly. The equity conversion process through audited channels. Every step left a paper trail that could withstand scrutiny. That was always the goal. Revenge that relies on chaos is unstable. Structural recalibration relies on records. A month after the summit, I received an offer from a private investment group interested in acquiring a portion of my building at a valuation 42% above what I paid during the buyout. I declined, not because the money wasn't tempting, but because control was worth more than liquidity at this stage. Instead, I refinanced again under improved terms, extracted modest capital, and acquired the adjacent property quietly through a separate entity. Expansion is most effective when it looks like maintenance. Emily noticed the acquisition when the public registry updated. She texted me a single line. "Adjacent property too?" I replied, "Structural symmetry." She didn't respond with sarcasm, just a simple understood. The public reputation shift solidified during Horizon's annual investor report. In the section outlining strategic partnerships, Alder Ridge Holdings was listed first. My name appeared in the footnotes as both majority stakeholder in the property and minority equity participant in the parent entity. Dual alignment. That phrase echoed through investor calls. It wasn't flashy. It was durable. I received invitations to speak on panels about long-term asset positioning. I accepted only two. Overexposure erodes leverage. In both appearances, I spoke about documentation, patience, and risk recalibration. I never mentioned family. I never referenced the rooftop speech. The audience didn't need the origin story. They needed the framework. The emotional aftermath was quieter. One evening, standing alone in the building lobby after most tenants had left, I looked up at the elevator indicators blinking softly above the marble floor. I remembered the night I scrubbed grout by hand because I couldn't afford another cleaning crew. I remembered reading lease clauses at 2 a.m. while my friends were out celebrating corporate bonuses. I remembered my mother's voice saying I never took risks. The memory no longer stung. It clarified. Risk had never been absent from my life. It had simply been invisible to those who equated volume with courage. Emily and I met for coffee one morning without agenda. No lawyers, no CFOs, just two siblings at a small table near the window. "Do you regret not selling your half back then?" she asked, stirring her cup slowly. I watched the steam rise between us. "No," I said. "Do you regret selling?" She considered that longer. "I regret not reading more closely," she admitted. That wasn't weakness. It was growth. "You read people," I said. "I read contracts." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why this works now." That conversation felt more satisfying than the applause at the summit. Not because I needed her validation, but because equilibrium had replaced imbalance. Financially, the numbers compounded predictably. Rental income stabilized under extended lease terms. Equity appreciation in Horizon's parent entity tracked upward under disciplined expansion. My portfolio diversified across adjacent properties and modest bond allocations. I hired a compliance officer not because I distrusted my systems, but because scaling requires delegation. Structure must outlive personality. That realization marked the final evolution. This was no longer about proving something to family or executives. It was about building something that functioned without my constant presence. The social exile people expect in stories like this never materialized because I never attacked. I enforced alignment. Those who respected structure respected me. Those who preferred narratives drifted elsewhere. That filtration felt clean rather than lonely. The final layer resolved itself quietly during Horizon's quarterly governance vote. A proposal surfaced to accelerate expansion into a volatile region with unstable lease guarantees. The board was split. The CEO looked toward minority stakeholders for input. I reviewed the projections carefully, comparing them against historical volatility charts and occupancy stability ratios. When my turn came, I recommended deferral pending stronger lease assurances. The vote followed my reasoning. Expansion delayed. Risk recalibrated. Emily caught my eye across the conference table and gave the smallest nod. Not gratitude. Recognition. The true victory was not in public reversal or financial gain. It was in emotional independence. I no longer measured myself against her promotions or my parents' expectations. I measured outcomes against documentation, against structure, against whether the foundation could withstand scrutiny. The night I walked out of the atrium ballroom, applause fading behind me, I thought the story had peaked. It hadn't. The real peak was quieter. It was the moment I realized I didn't need another public acknowledgement. I didn't need another stage. I had built something stable enough that silence no longer felt like invisibility. It felt like control. Standing once more in the lobby of the building I refused to sell, watching the city lights reflect across polished marble, I understood something simple and irreversible. Power that depends on applause evaporates when the room empties. Power that depends on documentation compounds when the lights go out. And if you've ever been labeled cautious by people who never read the fine print, tell me this, when the room finally goes quiet and the contracts are signed, who really took the bigger risk?